So our next speaker is Dr. Darrell Arnold. He is the editor of Traditions of Systems Theory from Routledge and Critical Theory and the Thought of Andrew Feenberg from Palgrave MacMillan. He has numerous translations from German into English, including Naturalistic Hermeneutics from Cambridge UP and Media of Reason, Columbia UP. From 2014 to 2019, Darrell was president of the Humanities and Technology Association, an interdisciplinary society for the study of areas at the juncture of technology and society. He has also served as the editor of the association's journal. Darrell is an associate professor at of philosophy at Miami Dade College. His dissertation from the Universitaet Bielefeld in Germany was on the 19th century life sciences and the thought of GWF Hegel. His presentation is titled From Hegelian Organicism to Boulding's Ecosystems Theory, Biological Holism and Social Theory. So without further ado, we look forward to Dr. Arnold's presentation.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak and to participate in this event today. I have to say, I wrote a dissertation on Hegel 25 years ago. So, and I have dealt with this stuff in the interim period of time. Uh, at the moment, I spend a lot of time on AI ethics and issues like that. But I'm happy to revisit this along with a lot of work I've done on systems theory. So let me then begin. The thing I want to do today, as I look at both Hegel and systems thinking, especially ecologically oriented systems thinking, is maybe a kind of uh, trivial thesis, but it's to draw attention to the fact that Hegel and these systems thinkers offer us at least heuristics that are badly needed in light of the ecological crisis that we're confronting. Um, I think, we all know there's a tendency for us to think individualistically. We have institutions that are built up that are rather focused on individual action on maybe individualist bases, and it's not enough to kind of reform our thinking about ourselves in the world, but it's certainly one necessary uh, ingredient for the kind of social change we need to confront the ecological changes that we're in. So that's kind of the background of why I was interested in agreeing to do the talk. I'm going to start today by talking about Hegel and how he, in working through difficulties in Kant's philosophy of nature, um, comes to view all scientific systems, a variety of other systems, including the state, as organic, and how he then pits his own organic view of the world against Kant's mechanical one. In this, he's doing what a lot of people in the Romantic period were doing. And though he aligns really with Kant more as an Enlightenment thinker, he does ultimately basically espouse the view of the Romantic contemporaries that Kant's thinking is too mechanistic and that we need to have a more organicist understanding of things. Now, Hegel formulates his views prior to the pressing ecological concerns that, we know from the 20th and 21st century. But he is seeing in the in the industrialization that he's a part of, the encroachment upon nature, and some of those concerns have to be kind of going on in the background. What he does is offer us a view of things that aligns then with, I think, the needs of his time to address already the encroachment upon nature, but also with the develops this in ways that align with later systems theoreticians. So he has what Anatole Rappaport, one of the early systems thinkers, long ago called a systems outlook. And so I'm going to describe a little bit of what that is in the first part of the talk. In the second part, I'm going to lay out some of the main characteristics that of that systems outlook, particularly as relevant to ecosystems theory or ecological thinking that becomes important in the 20th century up to our day. I'm going to highlight, in particular, the ecological thought of Arthur Tansley, the gentleman you see down here on the bottom left, and Kenneth Boulding. These aren't the best known of the ecosystems theoreticians, and I could have chosen any array of them to talk about. But I like Boulding's uh, way of taking and applying an ecosystems analogy. Well, he doesn't think of it as an analogy, actually. I think ecosystems concept to multiple entities in ways that are quite parallel to Hegel's application of an organicist concept to different kinds of entities. Tansley's in here because he's the first person to use the term ecosystem, and so I'm going to talk about him in due course. Um, so, we'll see Hegel relies on the study of 19th century biology in developing some concrete elements of his organic view. But for his most basic definitions of organic systems, he starts with Kant. It's important that we recognize that what Hegel says about such organic systems is not only applicable to biological systems, as I've said, but to other systems that he characterizes as living or organic. I don't think he's making just an analogy because he places this discussion in his logic, both in the encyclopedia and the science of the logic. And in those books, he's basically taking on a kind of Kantian project, I think synthesizing Spinoza and Kant in some particular ways, trying to think this whole through kinds of categories like Kant had developed. And he thought Kant's own list of categories was incomplete. He thinks of this organicist understanding as being the kind of culmination of his logic. So um, there he lays out these kind of basic categories. He adds little to the concise formulation of Kant's organic product of nature from the Critique of Judgment. I'll quote Kant because it's a little more succinct than Hegel. In such a product of nature, every part not only exists by means of the other parts, but is thought as existing for the sake of the others and the whole, that is, as an organic instrument. Hegel's later usage parallels this closely, sometimes exactly. For him, in an organism, each part is thought to exist as a means for the end or a tool or instrument, but it also exists. Uh, it exists then for the sake of the whole, but in a reciprocal relationship where the whole serves it. Now, Kant's own understanding is more or less functionalist. Insofar as the parts serve the whole, both thinkers of the whole as an end and the parts as purposes, but organisms are unique because they're only maintained if the parts, which are on one account means, are also ends. So, I mean, my kidney is there to help me, or my heart, but if my whole system doesn't coordinate to help keep my heart functioning, then I have a problem as well. So that's the kind of thing he's thinking about. And we'll see. Something maybe kind of interesting, I'll just drop here, when he talks about the state as an organism. You know, you can think of the citizens as members of the state, serving the state, but if the state doesn't serve its members and treat them as ends in themselves, that's that Kantian language, you know, morally, then it will ultimately not fulfill its purpose properly. Okay. Now, I'm going to move on here. So, that was just what I had in the last slide. So his definition also highlights this means-end relationship. Quote, the principle, which is at the same time a definition, is as follows. An organized product of nature is one in which every part is reciprocally purpose and means. In it, nothing is vain without purpose or ascribed to a blind mechanism of nature. Hegel later defines organized being as fully purposeful in a way that was a quote from Kant, sorry. Kant described them there. Okay, so again, this kind of stuff is taken largely from Kant. However, as he develops his views in ways that we'll see as maybe more useful still for ecology, and here I'm going to uh, basically be saying some things, or maybe not too dissimilar to what Krishna was earlier saying. You know, he draws on these biological concepts of Trevinus and Haller, two 19th century life scientists. He also is reading Lamarck and Cuvier. He does not embrace an evolutionary theory yet, so he's just before Darwin, and he sticks with the prevailing science of his time. But he describes basically the gestalt of the organism, that is, of any system, as the structure, and uses also in his encyclopedia accounts the ideas of sensibility and irritability from the biology of his day. So the system internal processes ultimately play their role in the third process, the reproduction of the system. But sensibility is the ability to feel or perceive. It's linked to our sensory apparatus. Irritability is seen as an ability of muscle to contract when stimulated. Okay, so something kind of similar goes on that allows a processing of information from outside of the system into the system, which allows the system to reproduce itself. In fact, these processes are of fundamental importance. The organism is a structure that is involved with the world outside itself by necessity. Okay, so again, it has this gestalt, this structure. It must turn outside itself in order to reproduce itself. Those are the three major structures that we see in Hegel. So obviously, we think of the heart as necessary. We think of the liver as necessary, and we have a close connection between those parts of the body under the skin, if you will. But clearly, it's just as necessary that we eat food. It's just as necessary that we get vitamin D from the sun. It's just as necessary that we drink water every day. So there is this dependence. We can think of ourselves in some senses then ultimately as maybe some organ within the organism of the absolute ultimately, or the idea, and of nature. Okay, so this organism concept can go kind of basically toward the description of any system. Let me see here. One thing that's kind of interesting is, well, I'll just read this for you. The living animal has a being only because it turns itself into what it is. So it's these internal processes that allow us to kind of consume the energy, if we use more modern language, that we've internalized. And we'll keep doing that. Eating, for example. In fact, I guess even some of your organs would be kind of eaten up eventually if you didn't get any food, and then you would die. So you're forced to turn outside of yourself in order to perpetuate yourself. It's pretty simple, but it's also very ecological, right? And at some level, we all know this. It's not really a great mystery, but I think that we don't tend to think about it. It comes obvious for us to think of ourselves as somehow independent, or at least, especially, maybe that's cultural as well. Particular cultures particularly focus on that individuality and that independence, when in fact, there's this pretty obvious dependence. So the system has to turn outside of itself, has this lack in itself, and it is moved to take more into its system. This requires assimilation. In this process, what's external becomes integrated into it. Okay, and so a lot of that stuff Krishna had talked about earlier. Now, one kind of interesting thing is that Hegel talks about the organism otherwise pretty much being in flux. It's these processes that are stable, but he talks about the bones of an organism basically changing everything in the organism. As we now know, all the cells in your body have been replaced after a 10-year period of time. Hegel has some inclinations of some similar ideas to that, right? So here's a quote from him. In that it is alive, the shape is essentially process. These processes are all that remain stable. There's no permanence about the organism. Everything is reproduced, even the bones. And then he continues, the organism is said to contain nothing of its former self after 5, 10, or 20 years. Okay, so kind of imprecise, but only the substantial form persists, right? It's kind of interesting. That's almost a Buddhist sensibility. It's a very Heraclitean sensibility. Hegel had read Heraclitus and said there was nothing in him that he hadn't integrated into his system. Well, Heraclitus's world is one of flux, obviously, and here but in which certain processes remain stable that kind of temper the flux. This is a suggestion of that type of thing in Hegel. Now, as I argue, and I think you can find if you read the encyclopedia and the Science of the Logic, um, even though he's using terminology and ideas from biology of his time, he does say philosophy owes its development to the empirical sciences. So he does think that the mental determinations of subjective Geist are responsible for our experience of the world, right? Um, and yet he seems to think that we can maybe more precisely articulate those at particular times, given developments of empirical sciences. Even I would argue, right? Um, and then he goes on. I think not to use the organism concept as a kind of an analogy. We can say, yeah, the state's kind of like an organism, or the system of science, of biology is kind of like an organism. I think he really thinks it's an organism. He's defined what that organism is, and he thinks it is one. Now, that might have some problems down the road when we get to A.G. Tansley, for example, and people who are kind of still under the sway of the romantics who are doing ecology. Hegel basically develops that, I think first uses that word, and then ecosystem is used by Tansley. And what's kind of happening that we're going to see Tansley takes issue with is people are coming in with these preconceived notions saying, well, if it's an organism, then it must function this and that way. And they're kind of reading, not so much trying to follow what the data shows them as kind of trying to fit the data into a preconceived notion. So empiricists will often have that problem with somebody who's taking a kind of definition like Hegel gives us and applies it in a more than heuristic way. Okay. Um, Hegel has some ideas here that are kind of interesting. He refers to the Earth as a dead organism. It suggests certain things, kind of like Gaia theory of James Lovelock, a cybernetician, by the way, a systems theoretician. Um, um, and then, like I said, these systems of the sciences, and so on. Now, I'm going to mention the state here kind of very briefly. So he says the organism is the constitution of the state. So the constitution kind of embodies the idea, the substantive idea of the people, the will of the people in the state. And it's something like this gestalt or this form. It has these genus properties. These are the living laws and institutions, and with which individuals approach new problems, assimilate new information, and so on. Now, the individuals in the state can be viewed as means because they are kind of helping the state to achieve its ends. And yet, I think we need to read what Hegel's doing here in reference to Kant's view that all individuals who are treated ethically have to be treated as ends in themselves. And so, Hegel's own political views, I mean, this has come up here a little bit. I mean, he was in favor of a constitutional monarchy, essentially. He did open a bottle of champagne every year on the day of the French Revolution to celebrate the French Revolution. He thought it was very important, but then he saw, kind of like so many other people, Beethoven and other thinkers, saw the kind of terrors of the revolution occurring, and withdrew from that, thought that the monarchy gave some kind of consistency to the system, and it would avoid the tumultuous shifts. He does argue for kind of people's representation through the guilds and things like this. But yeah, he's living in this period of time. The French Revolution has very mixed immediate results. He celebrates them, but with a bit of reserve, we can say. Um, but you end up getting the right and the left Hegelians coming out of him. Marx obviously is very inspired by Hegel in particular kinds of ways. So folks going off that direction who aren't, trying to basically tell us what Hegel said, but taking his thoughts and moving in other new directions with them. Um, I'm going to stop with that. So now I want to move on to talk about, you know, um, ecosystems theory. So the concept of the ecosystem, as I said, was first used by A.G. Tansley in an article in the journal Ecology. So the word ecology had been used, but it, you know, Hegel had used that, but the word ecosystem was not in use. And he uses this in an article with the very catchy title, The Use and Abuse of Vegetational Concepts and Terms. It makes me feel not so bad about the title of my paper. So while we see theoreticians maybe tip their hat to Hegel, the early systems thinker didn't really know Hegel's thought well. And so Tansley doesn't acknowledge him. The best known early systems thinker like Ludwig van Bartholonvie, Gregory Bateson showed no in-depth knowledge of Hegel's views, made no more than passing references to his thought. But I do think this organicism is in the air, and that's been influenced by him and a lot of the romantic thinkers. But in fact, we'll see Tansley, much like Hegel, is more influenced by the observations in the life sciences. And then some of these later systems thinkers, then I'm talking about Bolding in particular, will go on and apply these to both natural and cultural systems, now viewing them not as organisms, but as uh, ecosystems. So the first challenges to a predominant organicism of the 1930s still was a move to use ecosystems concept from the field of biology. As I said, Hegel had coined the term ecology in the 19th century. Now, Tansley was responding to what he viewed as a murky organicism widespread at the time of his writing. And he takes aim at the work of a Dr. Clements and a younger and adherent Professor Phillips. Phillips, in particular, is criticized for proposing a view for biological research that constitute a closed system and that Tansley sees as a kind of application of something like a religious dogma that comprises a confession of holistic faith. Both of these thinkers are thought to expand an organismal theory of vegetation that obfuscates in Tansley's views as much as it clarifies. So in particular, Tansley rejects the imposition of the interpretive schemata based on definitions of development that apply to what we commonly know as organisms. The difficulty arises because of the need to describe the integration of plant communities that clearly display some integration, but that do not display the same integration as individual organisms. So, I mean, I mentioned to you the heart, my liver, integrated into my own system as an organism, that I also have this need for sunlight and so on. Tansley would say that those are two different levels of integration, and we need to separate those. So Tansley, especially is looking at the way communities of plants are applied, and communities of bees, ants, termites. He thinks at best we should maybe characterize these as quasi-organisms. So basically, humans, animal communities are more integrated than human society. There's bees and so on. But human society and animal communities are more integrated than plant communities. None of them is as integrated as an organism. And so that's the particular frustration that Tansley has with Clements and Phillips' organistic perspective, which they're not using as an analogy, right? They're not saying they're like organisms, but that they are organisms, quite aligned, as I would think, with how kind of Hegel defined that concept in his logic. Now, Tansley does acknowledge his argument with Clements and Phillips turns on the meaning of words, but words are important. He thinks they overstate the precision. They overstate their case. So Tansley's fundamental point is that whatever similarities biotic communities have to organisms, there are also many dissimilarities. So we need a word to distinguish between the two kinds of objects. The term organism already refers to individual plants and animals. We should thus look for another term for these communities. And in the article, he's doing kind of a linguistic analysis of biological terms or ecological terms. Um, and he's concerned that basically these theoreticians are trying to make the facts fit the theory. Precisely often the claim made by empirical scientists of the Hegelian approaches to the world, and one of Tansley's main points can be summed up in his call for, quote, an empirical methodology and terminology on vegetation and avoidance of generalized interpretation based on the theory of what must happen because, quote, vegetation is an organism. By the way, Krishna, I don't know if you could let me know when I have about 10 minutes left. I forgot to look at my watch when I started this, so you might
Sure.
need maybe five after that. So
We started at about 10:20, so you're 25 minutes into your presentation.
okay,
Okay.
thanks. So he's also taking aim at a whole a slew of organicist philosophers, Whitehead among them, and so he doesn't think we should call the universe an organism. Um, he thinks these are something like confessions of holistic faith. And he's agitated by this philosophy again that he sees as over exuberantly using an analogy as if it's more than an analogy. So he dismisses it as philosophical, in a sense that he hardly admires. And so he says, well, we can call the whole universe an organism and the solar system and the sugar molecule and an eon or free atom. Now, it's in this kind of context. I'm going to kind of skip some of the details where he looks at, okay, well, maybe we should use the word biotic community. Maybe we should use the word biome. He's kind of searching for this word. And I'm going to skip the details of those arguments in the interest of time. But it's precisely in kind of working through that he comes up with this term ecosystem. So um, um, they're systems of some sort. He does concede they can have causal effects on individuals within the system. So interesting, this causality. So it looks like a kind of agency that an ecosystem has. Um, so in these special systems, these ecosystems that Tansley describes as biomes mixed with the inorganic, we have that causal property. Regarding the inorganic factors, he notes there could be no systems without them, and there is a constant interchange in the most various kinds within each system, not only between organisms, but between the organic and the inorganic. When Hegel writes about organisms, one of the biological organisms, he highlights these fascinating things that he and a lot of romantic philosophers of science were getting at, that we take the organism takes the plant takes the inorganic, takes the minerals from the water, the energy from the sun, and it transforms it into the organic. There's something quite extraordinary about that. But be that as it may, Tansley doesn't want to call the whole system an organism, but an ecosystem. And in the end, he started out with this description of an ecosystem, saying, look, it's a looser organized whole than an organism. But then when he spells out what an ecosystem is, he gives us a very expansive view, I think. So these ecosystems, as we might call them, this is a quote from him, are the most various kinds and sizes. They form one category of the multifarious physical systems of the universe, which range from the universe as a whole down to the atom. Oh, you know what? I think I was misreading that. So the physical systems of the whole range have a range of unities in them. So um, I think there's a reading that sees him as saying even the atom is an ecosystem, right? We're going to see people who go that direction. Actually, we're not going to see it, but somebody like Gregory Bateson goes in that direction. His suggestion is that it's necessary to study these systems individually and necessary in some sense to artificially isolate ecosystems in order to do that. So here's another quote. I think I might have skipped a couple of these slides. Let me try to catch up with myself. Here's a quote. Actually, the systems we isolate mentally are not only included as parts of larger ones, but they also overlap, interlock, and interact with each other. The isolation is partially artificial, but it's the only possible way in which we can proceed. So, I mean, I can't remember the language that Dr. Maybe used exactly, but you have these bridge systems. So you have a prairie that turns into a desert. Well, where's it the prairie, and where's it where does the prairie or the uh, Germans, what do you say, Vorwürste, and where does the desert begin? Um, you can isolate things in the water from things outside of the water. You kind of have to do that, although they are integral systems interacting with each other in some ways. He thinks for the basis for basic scientific research, in any case, we need to be able to kind of isolate some of these things. And what he says is there's a little bit of an arbitrariness to that, but it allows us to proceed. It allows our knowledge to progress. So ecosystems, in any case, are wholes of some level of integration that include organic beings and inorganic elements. They vary in sizes. One ecosystem can be part of a larger one. In fact, the isolation of one ecosystem is always nearly or partially, artificial. It's a demarcation made for practical reasons to understand the integrated set of plants, animals, and the inorganic environment, right? The ecosystem includes like the dirt and the rocks, not only the biome. In the end, Tansley appears to want to use the ecosystem concept to replace the organism concept in many places. But his observations have been very beneficial. There's a reason I think we call the field, ecosystems theory is applied largely. And he conventionally guards for limits to the organicist views in the study of these physical systems. Okay. Now, systems theory, as a kind of more general uh, endeavor, emerges really in the 1950s, 60s. It includes people from mathematics, from biology, from philosophy, from sociology. So we have 20th century figures like Niklas Luhmann, the kind of luminary of systems theory in Germany. We have Berda Lanfi, we have Gregory Bateson, we have a gentleman I'm going to talk more about, Kenneth Boulding, and Neumann, right? Some of it leads into basically artificial intelligence. The first kind of simple robots are built by systems theoreticians, or cyberneticians. The terms get kind of interchanged with one another. What I find most interesting are those folks who kind of look at, because of my interest in the environment, who take and develop an ecosystems model. And one of the person who I think not very many people know, has anybody here ever heard of Kenneth Boulding? Nobody, it might be nobody's ever heard of him before. Or here's a gentleman, I actually translated some stuff for this scholar when I lived in Germany. Peter Finke. Anybody ever hear of this guy? In
There's an individual named John Kindman, who based, I think, in Boulder, Colorado. He presented at our conference in 2019. I believe he spoke of Boulding's work.
Okay. So, yeah, so Boulding had been at Colorado State University. He's a founding figure in ecological economics, and his economic thought, there was only really one component of a more general social ecosystems view. So at a time when the field of economics was even more entrenched, well, arguably, than today in the neoclassical model, he was calling for a revision to economic modeling with a view to ecological sustainability, viewing the economy as one subsystem within a social ecosystem. Now, early on, he was a proponent of the kind of organism reminiscent of Hegel's. He refers to these unities as organisms. But by 1950, when he's writing A Reconstruction of Economics, he'd shed that view and begun to use ecological language to describe the social system. These are looser wholes than organisms. So um, there are not only natural ecosystems, but social system itself can be viewed as an ecosystem. In his designation, he insists, apparently in contrast to Tansley, is not merely analogical. Society, he says, quote, is an example of a general concept of an ecosystem. That is, an ecological system in which biological systems, forests, swamps, fields, are other examples. While there are nonetheless differences between these systems, there are also great similarities, and Boulding draws parallels between social and biological reformers. The physical world around us has long been formed and shaped by human uh, culture, by human reformers. Um, but we might view the field as natural, but since it's a biological system, but of course there were no wheat fields before humans began cultivating them. So um, he draws a kind of parallel between those people who go out and, if I go to my beach here, I live in Hollywood, Florida. I can look around. It looks like the natural world all around me, but people took and planted those bougainvilleas. They weren't down here in South Florida, and so many other things. The tomatoes, if you look at the history of these products, you see they were kind of created over time through people intervening in nature with a view to producing yields that were aesthetically pleasing to us and would meet our needs. But to get to the social reformers, he says the production of a lawn or of a wheat field is the result of deliberate human interference with the ecology of nature. Similarly, social reformers attempt to do to social systems what biological reformers have long done to natural ones. Quote, the whole political and social system is an attempt to do for society what a farmer does for a field, to add certain elements to the ecological system that will increase those populations which we regard as desirable, wheat, happy families, and to diminish those we regard as undesirable, tars, armies, criminals. So um, now it sounds like he's distinguishing between a natural and a kind of cultural system, which he does, I guess you could say, at one level of analysis. But in the organizational revolution in 53, he emphasizes that the social ecosystem and the naturalist ecosystem, in fact, are not two isolated systems, but rather the whole of creation forms one vast ecosystem. So again, the whole cosmos, I guess, is not so much an organism for him as an ecosystem, more loosely connected parts. Further, the social ecosystem, that is to say, is not complete in itself, nor is the biological ecosystem. If Kansas grows wheat today instead of prairie grass, and if milk cows thrive there where once buffalo roamed, the expansion lies largely in the social ecosystem. So the social ecosystem affects what we're doing with the natural world, right? Obviously the natural world affects social development in some way. So there's a reciprocal thing there, but the social system has been driving change in this area that we call the Anthropocene that our earlier speakers mentioned. So while it would be beneficial for some purposes to view the social and natural systems as separate, the unity of the whole must not be lost sight of, he emphasizes. So other thinkers like Gregory Bateson later highlight the kind of importance of the ideas that we developed you know, um, and the ideas, not only the ideas, but the systems that we put into place. So this is where you get kind of hints in Boulding, and I don't think he was very familiar with Hegel, but if you're tr trained in Hegel and you're reading him, you see he has this idea that there aren't just these ideas that move us. There are these things we put into the world, like legal systems, an economic system that have a kind. I mean, I don't know. I don't think he uses the word agency, but essentially they have some effect on what we do, right? And they're kind of set up with certain system parameters and for certain functions, and they are going to have effects on us. And ultimately, I'm going to just skip ahead here a little bit. Um, um, will say, look, we need to consider the effect of all of these systems that we're making, the ideas that we have, the economy that we have, the police system that we have, and so on the natural environment. Okay. So
Dr.
just
Arnold, if I can just give you a 7-minute warning, is that
that's
okay?
great. Okay. So he talks about systems of exchange. So that's the economy, population systems, systems of threat, like something like policing, education systems. So in a modern society, you have not just individuals acting, but you have mechanisms in place. You have legal authorities. You have training centers, all of those kinds of things. And what he's kind of drawing attention to with this ecosystem concept is that ultimately, the Earth has its laws that are not going to be kind of compromised. I don't know that he puts it exactly like that, but we need to then align those systems with, for sustainability, I guess we would say today. He was talking before they used that. Among the things is the system of technology, right? So, I mean, you can see clearly how technology shifts the biological world, right? We see, I'll give you one example. And this is an example from him. This is just what I'm bringing up. You introduce the automobile. It was originally a free time device for wealthy people. It didn't go very fast, 5 or so miles an hour. There weren't roads, there weren't stop signs, there weren't police, there weren't suburbs, right? And now, once people find these things attractive and you see, oh, they can go more than 5 miles an hour, they might be useful for certain kinds of things. Henry Ford has the insight to hire people to and increase their wages so they can buy a car. I mean, maybe it was a really bad decision given what we see happening because of it. But these become popular. Now you pave the roads. Now you have street uh, um, traffic regulations. Now you have street signs. Now you have tire centers. Now you get the possibility to live further away from the center of the city. So you build these sprawl. All of that affects the environment, right? And in ways he couldn't see, we now know of, the greenhouse gases that are a result of having introduced those cars. So at least we're informed enough now that we should be able to say, okay, well, let's maybe see if we can build train systems or greener cars or transform our world so that we align with this um, um, ecological need. So, years ago when I was working on this kind of stuff more than I've been able to in the last few years, I basically took my lead from this gentleman I mentioned, Peter Finke. He's a literature professor from Bielefeld, who I interacted with, who basically inspired me to get to know these systems thinkers. And he's one of the people. Bolding has something quite similar to this, who thinks of this Earth system as kind of fundamental. We come out of the Earth system, we're kind of evolving from it, and then we have these ideas that affect the natural world around us. We build these systems that have effects on the natural world around us. What we need to do is create sustainable systems, and the ecosystem analogy, I think, works very well as a heuristic for all of this. I don't know. I don't have a vested interest in whether we call that, a real ecosystem, and we call the social system as a real ecosystem or as a analogical ecosystem, as a mere heuristic. I do think and Hegel's organicism as well does take us some steps in the right direction, basically, of getting to think about ourselves in ways that it's necessary for us to think about. I think for the study of um, biological um, ecology, the ecosystem gets us further than the organistic concept of Hegel. And maybe for these things too. In any case, either of these that get us to kind of move beyond this focus we have on selves as somehow separate from the world, which is such a delusion, and that we have built so many kind of systems around, and we find it still expressed in everyday language, people talking about themselves being self-made men or something. I mean, it just doesn't, I can't get my head around how anybody could say something like that when, you recognize, I'll finish with one point. So it's both as bodies and as minds, I guess, that we are involved in this assimilation process. So as bodies, I have to assimilate vitamin D. I have to take food. I have to take water into myself. I'm in this interaction with this biological world around me. Now, one of the things about human experience is it's subjective. So you and I can take a bite of an apple. I don't know what the apple tastes like for you exactly. That's your private own experience. You can have a thought. I could see if you're happy or you're sad. I can have some kind of a sense maybe of what your thought is, but I don't know exactly what you're thinking. And so there's a subjective element to that thinking experience that we as organisms have. But the But you didn't get your words out of nowhere. You got your words from a learning system, right? You got first of all that you were engaged, or we were all born into a language system, right? And then we have a learning system. And so we all can sit around here, we can talk about ecology and we can talk about cells and molecules and organisms. And we all know what that means because we've all been trained and can, as subjects, understand what those words mean. Now, you know, Newton said his ideas came standing on the shoulders of giants. Even if we don't have insights like Newton's, the thoughts we have are because of being integrated into this social ecology, this kind of linguistic ecosystem, this learning ecosystem. And I think there's something really, really important at this moment that we need to acknowledge, and that is that we are not behaving in a way that is conducive to as much flourishing in the human future as an animal future as we might be, and that using this ecosystems concept or Hegel organicistic thinking as a heuristic could go part of the way in getting us to where we need to be. So I guess I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arnold. Um, your nice talk began with an overview of Hegel's organismic conception and how it kind of came from Kant's organismic conception as a response to it. Um, you discussed, very pertinently the sensibility and irritability as sensory and mechanical responsiveness of the organism. You discussed the three processes of the organism as gestalt or form, a process of assimilation, and necessary interaction with externality, and how the organism is in constant flux. These are all thoughts from Hegel, and you provided nice quotes that are useful to go back on and try to find where you got those and see the context of Hegel's discussions on those topics. And then you ended that section with a brief analysis of how that applies to the state and the role of a citizen as not only an end for the state, but also an end in itself. Then you started talking about systems thinking, particularly the work of Tansley and Boulding. You discussed Tansley as acknowledging that the environment is a unity like the organism, but it's less integrated than a biological organism. So he wanted to articulate that difference, which produced the term ecosystem, which we all are super familiar with. And you discussed some of the nuances in the thinking of how he got there, which is interesting to hear about. And you discussed Boulding, how he looked at ecosystems, biological ecosystems, and the similarities that human society has to them, and how, as he told the farmer and the field, the relationship between the farmer to the field is similar to a political or social system and the society as a whole. How the ecosystem of human organizations has particular ecosystem functions like political or population, economics, educational systems, legal systems, technological systems, and how there is an intrinsic connection between the human society and nature. You concluded with a very important lesson from all of that, how to think of ourselves as independent individuals, unrelated to otherness, is quite misled and can be self-destructive. And you highlighted the interconnectedness, really. And I hope that was a fair summary of what you gave. If there are any questions from anybody in the audience, please feel free to ask.
Thanks. I liked your summary. Julie?
Yes, thank you very much. That was a lot of fun. It made me think of a lot of things in Hegel, his argument in the phenomenology that the self is essentially social, the I that is we and the we that is I, though that's not an exact quotation. The idea, his interesting idea in the philosophy of right about how the state has a duty to ensure that poor people have an interest in the political system because they're essentially losers in the system. They're poor, right? So the state has a duty to ensure that they have an interest and participate, which is something we could certainly learn from. Um, Wearing my other hat as a disability and philosophy of disability researcher or theorist, one of the quotations you used, I believe it was Bolding, about ecosystems, made me wonder and want to ask you if you saw if there was a connection between some of this ecosystems discussion and the eugenics movement, given the quotation about wanting to want the society or the social ecosystem wanting to create, get or weed out, you know,
Hmm.
criminals and such, of course, added to that list, at least in the eyes of the eugenics movement, was, people with disabilities, for example. So, and given the time period you're talking about, the 1950s, that was a time period where the eugenics movement was still somewhat active, though it was fading by then after the Second World War. But just a question, do you see any connection between that kind of ecosystems analogy and the eugenics movement?
Well, I know I mean, I'm quite Bolding didn't have the sensibility. I mean, that wasn't aligned with what he was doing. He was really working on peace movements, and yeah, his own political sensibilities were quite different than that. I don't know. There's a book I read many years ago, and it's on my shelf in the other room. Is it called The Brown Green Movement? Something like that. It's about Nazi environmentalism, because one of the things that Hitler did was actually, pretty good for a lot of the environmental movement. But I would imagine, well, obviously, you would see something like that there. Now, as far as I know, nobody there was using this language exactly in this way that Bolding in like the 50s starts to develop it. Um, and the way Bolding, I think, would say that is, well, we need more schools to ensure that people don't turn to crime or something like that, right? So, I mean, and he does talk about, so it's not like weeding them out with heavy policing, though I think he does think you have to have policing. But his own sensibilities were much more, what do I want to say? Um, Liberal than that, I guess. Yeah, it's an interesting question because, yeah, when you speak of such things so broadly, you can obviously find people who would take them and go lots of different directions with them, and some that we might find really morally reprehensible. Um, Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Arnold?
Yes.
Dr. Wurs, yes, please.
Um, in the end, I was a little bit confused. You have described these five different systems, and who are the actors in these systems? Because, for instance, I was lacking a knowledge part system. I don't would see the technological system is the same as a science system. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Or
Uh,
are we part, as individuals or personalities, are we part in every single social system?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're parts of it. Now, there are lots of directions different systems thinkers go in talking about that. Humans are parts of the systems. I mean, they operate through us. I don't know if you've ever read Nicholas Luhmann. So, I mean, Bolding wasn't reading him or Talcott Parsons or some of these folks who talk about, or Habermas does this as a critical theorist, talks about kind of systems tendencies. Um, Luhmann's quite strict about it. He thinks the economy operates on the principle of profit and loss. And when you're in that system, and that's why I guess people go to work and they take off their moral hat, and all they're doing, they're not, and the moral system is operating on parameters of goodness and badness. And so you're kind of operating in different systems at the same time, but in the world of work or in the basic economy, when push comes to shove, it's going to be reduced to profit and loss, and all the human values are going to be kind of flushed out. So he's pretty radical in that way, and he thinks of these systems as kind of autopoietic, as having their own, whereas some of his students. Helmut Wilke was a guy who used to be in Germany, in Bielefeld. Um, and then other people who kind of integrate some of that, I think, well, they're kind of tendencies of us. They're always acting through humans, and humans have the ability to say, no, we're not in our economic system just going to think about profit and loss. We're going to think about the economy. Certainly,
Mhm.
Boulding thought the economy could function in a way to think on more than profit and loss, and that it should if it was going to be in any way sustainable economy. And so, but
Yes.
that's a matter of human beings who are the actors in these processes. Now, you go to work for a company, and the companies may be rewarding people on the basis of, you get a job as a CEO, and you get a better job as a CEO if you've turned profit. So maybe that gives you an incentive to cut the maintenance of the railroad that you're working at, increase the price of tickets, and for a few quarters you get profits, and now you can say, look, I've made all this money. I'm good at doing what you want me to do, which is making profit. And so now you should give me, and there's a lot of, there's a logic, there's a lot of, I would say there's a kind of a lot of peer pressure, and there's a tendency in that system to honor those things and to think of that system as isolated from other things. But I would just say it's a tendency. It's always working through people. And we could come into that system and we could say, just like we did with child labor, we at some point, there were arguments against getting rid of child labor that were based on profit and loss and some kind of utilitarian framework. And people were saying in the 19th century, well, look, we have all these factories set up for 12-year-olds to pull the switches. If we start putting them in schools and we don't have them working anymore, the economy is going to break down. Unfortunately for these kids, for the good of society, we just have to keep some child labor going on. But eventually, we got around to regulating it with the state regulations that said, no, every kid deserves an opportunity to participate in a system that offers, capitalist system that offers a sort of inequalities of wealth and so on. And we want to have a kind of equality of opportunity. To do that, we're going to have to readjust our things, and we're going to have to kind of
Mhm.
elevate our concern for morality and that fairness over the economy. Yeah. I don't know if I'm addressing your question adequately.
Yes, thank you. I still have questions because we have heard today of circular economy. So
Yeah.
we could also make a system where it is not loss and profit, but in a certain way, existential and ecological sustainability,
So
even in economics.
Bolding's really one of the first people to do this, to say that's what the economy has to do, is have this. So he's known, within economics, there's environmental economics, which starts doing things like putting prices on the cost of water production or something like that. They try to put a dollar amount on it. Bolding's this kind of grandfather or father of ecological economics,
Hmm.
where he said really it's the ecosystem values that have to be kind of primary. And I mean, and so if I go back to the child labor case, well, we decided we would relativize how much money people could make at the expense. They could make money, but not at the expense of children.
Hmm.
But we got to have an economic system where if you're going to make money, that's okay, but it's not going to be at the expense of the environment, right? Because these the greenhouse gases are causing climate change, and
Yeah,
it's not going to compromise with our desires. It
yeah,
is a system that's going to work a certain way. We know now better than he knew then, because he's writing about this stuff in the 50s.
yeah.
And so we really have to prioritize the ecological well-being over economic well-being, because economic well-being doesn't continue to exist without ecological well-being of a certain extent, right? So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, I want to talk about the question of agency in some way, because it does look like these systems kind of set up the way they are and then legally monitored the way they do seem to have some kind of effects on us, right? Now, we could set them up differently, but it's almost, I mean, it's not really free of individual agents, but I don't know. Now we're getting into AI, it might be, because now you just set up these algorithms that function a certain way, and there they go. So I mean, now we're kind of entered even a braver, newer, or I don't know,
Yeah.
frightening world than we were already in, where you had things like the state apparatus functioning a certain way, or the economic system exuding certain pressures uh, um, um, on your behavior, right? I mean, if you want to get ahead at work, well, okay, you got to just be cutthroat, you know. That's the way it goes. That's what the promotion demands. And so that's what we're going to do. And, you know, I guess I could say I'm not going to work for that, but now I'm making a compromise. I'm just not going to be successful the way we define it at work. Um, there's a lot of pressure coming out of that economic system to
Mhm.
behave a certain kind of way. And now with algorithms and AI, yeah, I don't know. I think we can maybe start to reconceive of this stuff as even more radically, their agency of systems. Although we can go back and reconfigure algorithms. I mean, for now,
Yeah.
probably for a while.
Thank you.